So we recently had another international elitist meeting in Dubai called COP28. And as usual, this was another elitist billionaire private jet event that was basically trying to figure out how to screw the rest of us out of a future, really, of any kind. On this channel, I usually discuss issues and events that are closer to home, but I'll make an exception with today's video only because of the insanity and the absurd kind of self-absorbed elitist schemes that are very clearly on display, and they're a direct threat to you and I, and really our ability of both us and future generations to have any future of any kind. Now let's get into the details and how they impact you and I and our communities where we live. And listen, I'm not the first to point this out, but it is worth repeating endlessly if necessary, because these guys, these billionaire political elite and cultural elite who kind of go to these fancy international conferences, none of them care about you or I, or any of the rest of us. Their recommended policies put them in direct warfare, really, against those of us who want to live our lives in freedom and have the ability to leave the world a better place for our children. And I know others are clearly seeing the same thing now. But most people are probably they tune out these fancy jet set conferences for the virtue signaling events that they really have become. However, it's really hard for any sane person to believe anymore that these guys just don't hate us. I mean, when I say us, really, I mean everyone in the world that isn't already basically inside these little elitist jet set kind of virtue signaling, taxpayer grifting world. And that's a very small group of people. And I mean, these guys have essentially declared war on everything that makes living a good life possible. Low-cost power, agriculture, free speech, rule of law, and meritocracy, all of these are pillars of a modern, functional, free society. Not a perfect society, just a more perfect society for regular people that whatever weird greenish orthodoxy cult that these guys are dreaming about, apparently they don't like it. Now, most obviously, these guys are exceptionally focused on making life as expensive as possible for you and I. And it starts with energy, which is a fundamental building block for modern humanity to flourish. And if predictable, affordable energy supplies are taken away from us, then our ability to live in modern society is made a lot more difficult and expensive. And that is exactly what they want. Using climate alarmism or taxpayer-subsidized scams and other schemes, they're rapidly finding ways to increase the cost of energy, not because energy supplies are running out. No, because they want to increase the costs. Now, keep in mind, none of these decisions and these kind of crazy corrupt policies, none of these are going to impact the political elite one bit. They will always be able to afford or subsidize the cost for themselves, of course. None of these policies are going to impact them, not in any practical way. They're all hypocrites. They know it. And you and I know it, and they don't even really care if you and I know it because they know that it's only going to impact you and I and future generations that will most certainly suffer for these artificially inflated energy cost schemes. Now let's take these insane policies and then apply them in my state of Washington. First, they had to pretend that hydropower isn't green or renewable, like gravity stopped happening and rain stopped falling. So instead, they take 80% of the power that's supplied in our state by hydropower and they force utilities to install far more expensive and unreliable energy sources like windmills and solar. Then they pass the costs on to the consumer, so our power bills keep going up. And sure, they give kickbacks to their friends to install and promote these unreliable programs so that those lucky corporations can then in turn funnel campaign cash back into the system. But that's just a side bonus to lubricate the system and to kind of keep this grant grifting program going. Then, of course, Governor Gregoire in 2011, she decides to shut down the only coal-fired power plant in our state, TransAlta, which is actually just a few miles away from where I live. Now, that long-term, low-cost source of power goes away completely in 2025, and the replacement plans for the site won't be replacing the lost power generation at all. At the same time, in an effort to further degrade low-cost power, it was just revealed just recently that the Biden administration had decided and agreed, of course, in some kind of insider kickback scheme, one of these sue and settle lawsuits, that the Biden administration would take out the 4 hydroelectric dams on the Snake River. I mean, they haven't breached the dams yet, but our elitist politicians and their political donor class are working hard to make your cost of living as high and unreliable as possible. And this is just one step along the way. I mean, they did take out the Elwha Dam a few years ago. It was kind of a practice run out on the Olympic Peninsula. So our elitist geniuses in charge, they want to take one of the lowest cost electrical grids ever made in world history, built up over many years by the labor and the treasure of previous generations in our state, including my great-grandparents, and then destroy everything as quickly as they possibly can. But don't worry, they tell us. They're going to replace everything that they destroy with something else in the future. But they want to destroy what we have and what actually works right now, and then just replace it maybe with some type of landfill technology that'll be far more expensive, like windmills, certainly less reliable. And they're not going to help with those EV power stations that taxpayers are subsidizing all over the state that are going to require more and more power. I mean, keep in mind, at the exact same time that they're planning to increase the power draw from the existing grid by making natural gas illegal in new home construction, Seattle and Spokane, for example, and then subsidize electric cars, which draw a lot more power from the grid. Now, each of these policies, these bills, kickbacks, and kind of grifting schemes, while they're endorsed by the jet set, kind of our little overlords there, and angry Swedish teenagers and corrupt politicians at this COP28 in Dubai, they're going to have a net impact that actually hurts you and I, and the ability of our community to survive. They all make life more expensive and more difficult in the future. And there's no payoff except to the political insiders who can extract the kickback cash and get on the inside for those temporary gravy trains. And this is really just insane. Now let's look at agriculture, because these same crazies have been attacking and undermining agriculture for decades, and not just in the Netherlands and Sri Lanka. But these are actually pretty decent recent examples of how politicians and elitist political policies shouldn't be used to dictate on the ground farming practices. And when they do, the results get ugly and self-destructive. Sri Lanka, which is just an island country south of India, they went from basically an agriculture exporting, very prosperous nation into a completely collapsed basket case in just a few years. And part of this was really this command and control economic approach to forcing agricultural practices on the farming community, which resulted in a 40% crop yield reduction. Now, some have called this an attempt basically to implement organic farming practices overnight, but the top-down central control program didn't work in Sri Lanka any better than it worked in the Soviet Union. And the resulting collapse has harmed this island nation of 22 million people and created an economic and humanitarian crisis that appears unlikely to end soon, with the political elite determined to follow their instruction from groups like these world political elites that are telling them what to do. And we're witnessing similar harmful policies in the Netherlands and Europe, where basically this kind of ham-fisted central planning scheme of the political elite appears determined to destroy one of the agricultural breadbaskets of Europe. I mean, why does this matter in our country and my state of Washington? Well, primarily, this is because the central planning geniuses who are directing and demanding the agricultural policy changes resulting in terrible outcomes in Sri Lanka and Netherlands, they're also working hard to implement their failed policies in America, and of course in Washington state as well. The war on farming in America, particularly in the West Coast, that takes actually many forms, but the political and financial support are almost exclusively on this kind of lefty, elitist side of the political spectrum. By restricting access to water, diminishing property rights, imposing irrational and kind of costly regulations, and then actively destroying the infrastructure of agriculture, it is possible to eventually reduce agricultural production. Certainly, every step along the way that increases the cost to produce food will ultimately increase the cost of food for the consumer. It's a concept that no greenie apparently understands, and no elite politician attending COP28 really, they don't really care about it. They just don't care because they know it doesn't affect them. Now, one challenge for agriculture today is the fact that over 70 years ago in America, the percentage of the population who actively participate in farming used to be about 35%. Now, at the current level, they're basically at 2% or even less of the population. So most people today are completely ignorant and have no experience with agriculture or farming practices. Yet they do seem determined to impose central planning mandates that all increase the costs and impact the ability to farm. Even the dam removal plan that Biden wants to reward to his enviro friends on the Snake River, these are going to result in substantially higher costs to transport food because the existing dams in the Snake River, they actually helped grow a very important agriculture barge program that will be destroyed by the Biden destruction plan. Now let's look at the collapse in the rule of law, free speech, and meritocracy, which kind of seem to be the other pillars of a modern society that our jet-set elite just seem so determined right now to destroy. Now, obviously, they start with the hollow shells of modern education, where dumbing down the next generation seems to be their highest priority. And it isn't just Evergreen State College that's turned itself into a goofball show. I mean, that's become kind of a weird culture and indoctrination centers all over the place, determined to kind of create ignorance and to graduate groupthink Borgs to harm their communities as soon as they get out. And again, as I said, it's not just Evergreen, it's merely every academic institution, almost everyone, in our country today. There are some exceptions, of course, but those places are rare. Destroying meritocracy starts with pretending everybody deserves a trophy and then giving everybody an A in school. And it includes California removing all advanced education classes and Washington State's trying to get right there, right behind them. Plus, it helps if you remove discipline, consequences, and basically all benefits for doing your best. Using the modern wokester kind of world religion, pretending that everyone's either a victim or an oppressor, and that everything is oriented around this. Well, what do you think is going to happen? Exactly what you see today. A whole flood of kids brainwashed into believing that they need to compete in the victim status Olympics and randomly picking whatever category of self-identity that they think gives them an edge in the victim culture competition. Now, inevitably, this is going to lead to a similar degradation of the rule of law and meritocracy and free speech. And it isn't irrational. When you create a fake way of measuring people's self-worth or value to society by assigning them some type of victim class, you're going to destroy their drive or willingness to persevere over difficulties and challenges. And then at the same time, you're going to encourage them to create false narratives about themselves. Both of these trends destroys the concept of meritocracy. You didn't do well in the SAT, it must clearly be racist. You didn't get that job, life is terribly unfair. We see these trends whenever intersectionality and the diversity, inclusion, equity agenda takes root like kind of a noxious weed. Meritocracy, regardless of your background, race, or religion? No way. That's clearly racist. And so striving to be your best, striving to do your best, and striving to create the best place, that just kind of collapses and goes away. This isn't an accident. This is a feature, not a bug, of our elitists kind of attacking the rest of us. They don't get harmed by it, but we sure do. Now, as part of that feature, it means that the rule of law can no longer be applied equally to all. You must assign victim status to some and then apply guilt on others, regardless of what they've actually done. Now, this can be politically driven, like the J6 treatment of protesters compared to the 2020 violent rioters, or it can just be an obvious intersectionality DIE program, diversity, inclusion, equity, where you basically keep taking these violent felons and letting them loose to kind of prey on their fellow citizens because they're just misunderstood. It leads to crazy and obviously harmful policies in my state, like cashless bail, putting violent sex predators next to children's playgrounds, and unequal treatment under the law. Built in again, of course, as a feature, not a bug of this effort. And finally, one of the key attacks on us includes censorship, probably the most important attack. And I believe that most people are generally good and they're willing to make the right decisions, most people, if they actually know the truth. So the most important thing to these elitists is to conceal the truth and protect the narrative, whatever that political narrative is. George Orwell's 1984 actually got this quite right, and he understood what Stalin's Soviet Union was trying to do. But it was far more than some Soviet plan to enforce their narrative. Our elitists today, they need everybody to be just as ignorant as possible, and they absolutely must silence all dissent and control the narrative so that they can control us. I mean, censorship it's really just as simple as this, and it's as old as tyranny. There's nothing new about what we see today other than the fancy jets, the big ticket powwows in Dubai, and the big tech titans that are eager and willing to help our political overlords prevail with their messaging. This is just how you gain total control. But the result isn't very good for the rest of us. It might be good for the political elite, but not for the rest of us out there. So somebody recently stated that the COP28, that COP28, was just an open assault on the pillars of modern prosperous society. They aren't even pretending to care about the people anymore. They just want us to be subservient and submit to their plans. I don't actually think this is going to work out for them, not very well. Certainly not like they planned, because all plans come crashing down, particularly when they're built on such shaky ground and so harmful to so many people. But maybe this is the point. I mean, their grand schemes may not succeed in the way they're planning, but they certainly can do a lot of harm to the rest of us on their way to that failure point. Our political elite, they don't really suffer the same kind of consequences, but the rest of us absolutely do. So this is actually why we must continue to expose the truth where we live, local, state, national, and obviously around the world. You have to do your best to prepare yourself for the tough times and educate your kids to be more self-reliant and skilled than these political clowns certainly want you to be. When times get tough and their plans fall apart, it's going to be up to us and our families and our communities to fix what they broke. But we should never forget how we got here, and we need to do our best to reduce the damage that they're planning to do to us right now. In the end, it actually falls on you and I and our families and in our local communities to be prepared and survive the damage that these guys plan to inflict on us. Nobody's actually coming to save us. It's up to us and those that we work with today to weather the future storm that these guys are bringing. Start now and prepare, because in the end, the future's only going to belong to those of us who show up.